Good evening. It's great to be with you on a Monday. Let's light up the darkness. Gonna keep it moving. We have a double daf. We're gonna cover 2 pages tonight because Nina and I have an event here in LA tomorrow night. So no class tomorrow night, but we're gonna get ahead tonight with a double page. Who is with us? Learning very fascinating stuff on a Monday night. Stephen in New Hampshire, Yehuda in South Carolina, Nancy in North Carolina, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bella in Florida, PK in Colorado, Franco checking in from Trieste, and Paula loves the Song of the Birds, and Joseph in Massachusetts, Sharon wishing us a good evening from New Jersey. Thank you, that's so sweet. Saying shalom, great teacher Sal. We're going to talk about how one is meant to greet their teacher and how long it should take. Marjorie in Georgia, Marie and Maud in, I forget where you are, but saying shalom, Sal and Nina. Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you with us. Today's episode of AT Daily sponsored by Wayne Marble, who wants to say shalom, Pearl. So shalom, Pearl. Wayne, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. We say amen, and thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. If you want to sponsor an episode of AT Daily or just support our nonprofit organization, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Okay, we are in chapter 4 of Tractate Nazir. This is the 17th volume of the Talmud, the laws of Naziris, taking the Nazirite vow to abstain from products of the grapevine, becoming impure for the dead, cutting one's hair, and promising, vow you're going to become obligated when you take this vow to bring the offerings of a Nazir at the conclusion of that term of Naziris. Now we're in chapter 4. Yesterday we covered Mishna number 1 of chapter 4, which is all about a dependent vow or a linked vow, meaning somebody says, I am hereby a Nazir, so he becomes a Nazir for an unspecified term, and a person standing next to him says, and I. We started to introduce this idea. Now we learn also, so if this second person says, and the third person says, and I, so the other two also become Nazirim. Then if the first one has his vow nullified, because the second and third ones, they made a vow that was linked to or dependent on the first one, if that first guy gets his vow nullified, the later ones do also. We saw the case of a husband who vows Naziris, and his wife says, and I. Now, as a husband, he can nullify her vow, and his vow will remain intact. But if a wife says, I am hereby a Nazir, and the husband says, and I, so now he cannot nullify her vow, even though a husband normally has the ability to nullify his wife's vows, because he added his own vow dependent on his wife's. The effect of nullifying his wife's vow would be to nullify his own, and a person is not permitted to nullify his own vow. That's the Mishnah. There's some nuance to that ruling, as we shall see today when we get into the Gemara. Here's the Gemara. We picked this up near the bottom of page 20a. Our pages tonight are 21 and 22 here in Tractate Nazir. The Gemara on Mishnah number 1 of chapter 4. Reish Lakish, right? We've seen him many times. He's generally the debate partner of Rabbi Yochanan. Reish Lakish sat before Rabbi Yehuda Nesiya. Sounds familiar. Not Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, known as Rebbe, the redactor of the Mishnah, who was also the Nasi, right? He was the head of the rabbinic community. His son was Rabbi Gamliel. His grandson was Rabbi Yehuda Nesiya. So Reish Lakish was a student of Rabbi Yehuda Nesiya, and so was Rabbi Yochanan. So Reish Lakish is sitting before Rabbi Yehuda Nesiya, and he sat and said in explanation of our Mishnah, and this law, that they are all Nazirim, the ones who say, and I, and then the next one says, and I, after the first one says, I'm hereby Nazir. This law that they are all Nazirim applies only when they all took a vow by associating themselves with the previous vow within the time required for speaking a short phrase. So you can't say, I say, I am hereby, this is just for educational purposes, not making a vow. If I said, I am hereby a Nazir, and somebody's standing nearby, and he looks at me, and he waits, and then he says, and I, he has said nothing at all. It's unclear what his and I was referring to. It really has to have some rhythm. I'm cutting together our movie right now in the editing room, and it's all about rhythm, right? So if the dialogue was, I am hereby a Nazir, and I, then that one became a Nazir. But if the rhythm is, I am hereby a Nazir, and I, he didn't become a Nazir, right? So the amount of time matters. And how much time can pass? Well, it's the amount of time required for speaking a short phrase. And the Gemara asks, how much time is included in the measure within the time required for speaking a short phrase? And the Gemara answers, it is the time necessary for greeting someone. So the Gemara asks, and how much time is necessary for greeting someone? Right? It's an old joke, in terms of greetings of hello or greetings of goodbye. That some people, leave without saying goodbye. What's a Jewish goodbye? It's saying goodbye without leaving, right? Because at the end of the night, you're near the door. Oh, and another thought. Oh, and there was this story. And oh, when are we going to see you again? And the goodbyes could take half an hour, right? So how long does it take to greet someone? And the Gemara answers that it is the time necessary for a student to say, peace upon you, my teacher. What is that? Shalom alecha, Rabbi, right? Or rabbi. Right? That's how long it takes. That's the short phrase. That's the formula, the amount of time that it takes to say, Shalom alecha, Rabbi. Okay? So Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya said to Reish Lakish, well, once again, you have provided no advantage to a student who wishes to associate himself with the Naziris of another. Because if the student's rabbi was passing by, remember rabbi means teacher, if the student's rabbi was passing by at the precise moment that his colleague was vowing to be a Nazir, well, he would have to greet his teacher first, and therefore he would not be able to respond to his colleague's vow in time. And this is also taught, now we're at the top of 21a, this is also taught in a Baraisa. In the case of one who said, I am hereby a Nazir, and another heard him and waited the time required for speaking a short phrase, and once that time had passed, then he said, and I. So the first person is bound by his vow, and the other is permitted, meaning Naziris did not take hold on the second person, as too much time passed between their respective vows. And how much time is the time required for speaking? It is the time necessary for a student to inquire after the welfare of his rabbi. Well, that sounds like it could be a long conversation, but in the end, the law is the amount of time it takes to say, Shalom Alecha, Rabbi. So the Gemara suggests, shall we say that the Mishna supports Reish Lakish's opinion, as it is taught in the case of one who said, I am hereby Nazir, and another heard him and said, and I, and a third person heard him and said, and I. They are all Nazirim. And the Mishnah mentions and I twice and no more, which indicates that only two people can associate themselves with the vow of the first one. And the reason for this must be because too much time has passed since the first person spoke. Now, the Gemara rejects this argument. This is no proof. Should the Tan have continued reckoning cases like a peddler who announces his wares over and over again by repeating and I over and over again? What they're talking about, we know that the one who said, I am hereby a Nazir, he became a Nazir. Then the one who says right away, right, in less time than it would take to say Shalom Alecha Rabbi, in less time than it would take to say those three words, 5 seconds, right? So within 5 seconds, the second one says, and I. He becomes a Nazir. And the Mishnah told us that a third person, if he should say, and I, he becomes a Nazir also. Now, are we counting that the third person has to say it within, let's say, 5 seconds of the first person saying, I am hereby a Nazir? Or does the third one just have to say it within 5 seconds of the second one saying, and I? So the Gemara offers, well, it must be the first case, that the third one has to say it within the 5 seconds from the first person. So the rhythm would be, I am hereby a Nazir, and I, and there's no more time left for a fourth person to come in and add his and I, and that they would all become Nazir. That's one view. And the other view is, no. As long as the people who follow after just say it within the time it takes to say Shalom Alecha Rabbi, of just the one who spoke before him, then the linkage could keep going. And so they would all become Nazirim in a case where I am hereby Nazir, and I, and ad infinitum, as long as the last one spoke within that short amount of time, after the previous one spoke, the one right before him. So they're arguing on it, and they're saying, well, the Gemara only included 2. So it must be that it can only happen twice, and they're limited to saying it within that short amount of time of the original statement. And that's why the Mishnah only included 2. And the rebuttal of the Gemara is, what, are you kidding? You think that the only way that we can assume that a 4th and a 5th and a 6th would also become Nazir if it was stated in the Mishnah? Is the Mishnah going to keep adding the examples so that we would understand that the examples can go infinitum? No, of course not. We should just learn it out from the fact that there's 2 examples that it could go on and on. So the Gemara raises a difficulty. But if the Tana of our Mishnah wishes to be concise, so let him teach only one example and teach us these other cases of others who say and I by means of a single example. Right? If it's enough to say and I, and then we could extrapolate that people can keep saying and I. But since it taught 2 cases, maybe it taught 2 cases, just 2 and I's, to limit how far it can go. And it's only the 2 people can say and I, and the 3rd, 4th, and 5th aren't going to get there within the time it took to say, Shalom Alecha Rabbi, of the initial statement, I am hereby a Nazir. So the Gemara answers, indeed, this is in fact correct. It could have been one example. But because the Tana teaches in the latter clause, if the vow of the first was dissolved by halakhic authority, then they are all dissolved. But if the vow of the last individual was dissolved by halakhic authority, then the vow of the last individual is dissolved, and all the others remain bound by their vow. So one may conclude by inference that there is a middle person between the first and the last. And it was due to that reason that the Tana of our Mishnah taught 2 and I's to show you that there's a chain, right? And if the last one has his vow nullified, everyone before him, the original vower and the second one, they remain bound by the vow. Only the third one would have his vow nullified. Whereas if the original vower had his vow nullified, then everyone who came after him also has their vows nullified. That's the principle taught in our Mishnah. And due to that, and that's why the Tana had to include at least 2 extra cases to create a chain. Now, with regard to the same issue, a dilemma was raised before the sages. Does one take a vow by associating himself with the vow of the other, i.e. the individual who spoke immediately before him? Or perhaps they all associate themselves with the vow of the first one. Well, granted, you can make a chain with 10 people in it, all saying, and I, and I, and I, and I. Now, all these people, is their vow associated only with the original guy? All right, and we know that if he says, that the one who said, I'm hereby Nazir, if he has his vow nullified, everybody else has their vows nullified too. But what if we had 10 guys, and I, and the 5th one had his vow nullified, right? So do we say that the ones that came after him, numbers 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, they also have their vows nullified since they're in a chain associated to him? Or is everyone in the chain merely linked to the original vow, I am hereby Nazir? So if number 5 has his vow nullified, 6 through 10, their vow remains in place. Which is it? Right? And so that is the difference, whether you're linked to the guy before you or to the original guy. Now the Gemara explains that. So what is the answer to this dilemma? And the Gemara suggests, come in here a proof from the Mishnah. With regard to one who said, I am hereby a Nazir, and another heard this vow, and said, and I. And a third person added, and I. So they are all Nazir. They're all Nazirim. So the Mishnah mentions only 2 individuals who associated themselves with the initial vow and no more. So learn from this that they all associated themselves with the vow of the first one, and they all spoke within the short amount of time of the initial statement. As if it should enter your mind that each person associates himself with the vow of the one just before him. Then let the Mishnah teach, and I, many times. And the Gemara rebuts this as before. That's no proof. Should the Tana of the Mishnah give 5, 6, 7 examples of and I in order to make that point? That's not necessary. He's not a peddler hawking his wares and saying, and I, and I. It's enough to give 2 examples and we can learn the principle. So the Gemara asks, but if the Tana of our Mishnah wished to avoid repeating and I so many times, so let him teach it only once, and we could learn that they are all Nazirim based on that example. And the Gemara answers, since the Tana needed to establish at least the concept of a chain, he needed to do 2 and I's for that purpose, but he didn't need to do any more. So the Gemara suggests, okay, well, we still haven't answered the question. Are they all associated with the original vow, everyone who said and I afterwards in a chain, or is each person associated with the one who came just before him? And then we could break the chain in the middle, and everyone after would have their vows nullified, but the people before that in the chain wouldn't. So the Gemara suggests, come in here a proof from the Mishnah. If the vow of the first individual was dissolved, they are all dissolved. So this indicates that it is only if the first one was dissolved that they are all considered dissolved. However, if the vow of the middle person was dissolved, no, the vows of the individuals following him are not considered dissolved. And learn from this that they are all associated with the first one. And the Gemara says, no, that's wrong. Come in here a proof. Right, that's wrong. And the Gemara says, I could say to you that actually each associates himself with the vow of the one who came immediately before him in the chain. And therefore, if the vow of the middle person was dissolved, the vows of all those who came after him are also dissolved. But since the Tana of our Mishnah wanted to teach, they are all dissolved. And had he taught the case where the vow of the middle individual was dissolved, he would have had to state that there is still the vow of the first individual that is not dissolved, because his vow is not dependent on that of the middle one. And due to that reason, the Tana teaches the case where the vow of the first one was dissolved, and consequently no proof can be brought from here. So the question still remains open. So the Gemara suggests another proof from the Mishnah. Come in here. If the last one was dissolved, the last is dissolved. And the rest of them are all bound by their vows. So it can be inferred from here that only in that case is the vow of the last one alone dissolved, as he is not followed by anyone. However, if the dissolved vow was one of the middle one, who is followed by someone else, then the vow of the last one who comes after him would also be dissolved. And one can learn from this that each one associates himself with the previous individual. But the Gemara rejects this claim as well. Actually, I could say to you that they all associate themselves with the vow of the original person, the one who said, I'm here by Nazir. And what is the meaning of the last one that the Mishnah teaches? It actually refers to the middle one in the chain. The dissolution of whose vow does not cause the vow of the person who followed him to be dissolved. And why is the middle one called the last one in this explanation? Since the Tana earlier taught first, here he taught last, just to distinguish from the original vow. And the Gemara further suggests, come in here, as it is taught in a Baraisa explicitly. If the first one is dissolved, they are all dissolved. If the last one is dissolved, the last one is dissolved, and they are all bound by their vows. And if the middle one is dissolved, the vows of anyone from him and after him are dissolved, and those who vowed from him and before him are bound by their vows. And one can learn from this that each associates himself with the vow of the previous individual. And the Gemara concludes, indeed, learn from this that it is so, and that is the law. When you have this guy says, I am here by Nazir, and then a bunch of people in a row say, and I, and I, and I, each one is associating his vow, linking his vow to the one that came before, the one that he spoke his and I within the period it takes to say that short phrase, Shalom Alecha Rabbi. He has to say that within that amount of time before the previous and I. So the link is always, you are linked to the one that you spoke your vow, very proximate in time to. And therefore, if there's a chain of 10 people, then the one who spoke fifth, and I, goes and has a halakhic authority nullify his vow, so he and everyone who came after him, all their vows are dissolved. But the ones who came before him, their vows remain in place. Now, the Mishnah taught that one stated, I am hereby a Nazir, and if another heard and said, my mouth is like his mouth, and my hair is like his hair, that this second person is a Nazir. It's the same as saying, and I. So the Gemara asks, well, just because he said my mouth is like his mouth and my hair is like his hair, he becomes a Nazir? It's not the same as and I. He just said my mouth is like his mouth. Maybe he's referring to, he's commenting that, my lips are about the same size as his lips. Or my hair, I use the same hair products on my hair that he uses on his hair. How do we know that my mouth is like his mouth and my hair is like his hair? Means and I, and that he becomes a Nazir. Now we're on 21b. So the Gemara raises a contradiction against this. If one said my hand is a Nazir, and similarly if he said my foot is a Nazir, he has not said anything. However, if he said my head is a Nazir or my liver is a Nazir, then he is a Nazir. And this is the principle. If one accepted Nazir is by means of an entity upon which life depends, i.e. a limb or a body part that he cannot survive without, so he is a Nazir. And conversely, if he mentioned a part of the body that is not essential for life, he is not a Nazir. So in this case, so now in our case of the one who said my mouth is like his mouth, my hair is like his hair, well, as he referred to his hair, which is certainly not a vital part of him, he should not be a Nazir. And Rav Yehuda answered that it means that he said like this. This is what he intended. Let my mouth be like his mouth with regard to abstention from wine, and let my hair be like his hair with regard to abstaining from cutting it, which are definitely related to being a Nazir, and that's why he became a Nazir. Right? Now you might say, why would anybody say, let my mouth be a Nazir or let my liver be a Nazir? Why wouldn't you just say, I am hereby a Nazir? And my answer to you would be, of course, most people would speak in a clear manner if they were going to undertake such a serious vow as Naziris, but then there would be no interesting legal question. Right? And so the Talmud will spend much more time on these odd liminal cases because that's where the interesting discussion lies. And occasionally people do speak in this weird, obtuse manner, and then we would have to know what the result is. But even if it never came up in the real world, studying such cases brings out God's will as we are coming to understand it in the law. And that's why study is so important. So the Mishnah taught that if a woman said, I am hereby a Nazir, and her husband heard, and he said, and I. So he cannot nullify her vow because his vow is depending on hers. Right? So if he nullifies her vow, his vow will be nullified, and a person is not allowed to nullify his own vow. So a dilemma was raised before the sages. When a husband nullifies the vow of his wife, does he uproot his wife's vow, making it as though she never vowed? Or perhaps he merely severs her vow from that point onward, but her vow was still in effect until he nullified it. And the Gemara asks, well, what difference is there resulting from this dilemma? Right? A woman vows Nazirs. Her husband can nullify her vow. So did he nullify it so that it's as if her vow never existed? Or did he nullify it such that he severs it from that point forward? She's not going to have to bring the offerings of Naziris at the end of her term because her term is now ended, cut off. There is no more Naziris for her. But what if she became impure from a corpse, right? Walked into a cemetery while her vow was still active? Does she then become liable to bring the offerings of impurity, which would indicate that the husband's nullification severed her vow from that point onward, but what she did before the nullification is still a transgression that she has to bring an atonement for? Or does the husband uproot her vow entirely, in which case if she became impure while her vow was active, it's as if nothing happened at all, and she's not liable to bring those offerings. So the Gemara, explains the difference. With regard to a woman who vowed to be Nazir, and another woman heard and said, and I, And the husband of the first woman heard and nullified her vow. So if you say that the husband uproots the vow entirely, then the vow of that second woman should also be dissolved, as she associated herself with a non-existent vow. And if you say that the husband's nullification severs her vow from that point forward, okay, so then the vow of his wife is dissolved. But the other woman who took a vow saying, "and I," after the first woman spoke, that woman's original vow was real. It was active for a time until the husband nullified it. So the second woman's vow remains in place. So what is the answer to this dilemma? And the Gemara suggests, come in here the statement of the Mishnah. If she said, "I am hereby Nazir," and her husband heard and said, "and I," he cannot nullify her vow. And if it should enter your mind that the husband severs the vow from that moment onward, so let him nullify the vow for his wife, and he will remain bound by his vow, just like the second woman would remain bound by her vow, since if the vow is not nullified retroactively, her vow was intact when he associated himself with it, when he said "and I" about his wife's vow, "I am a Nazir." So rather, one must conclude from this that the Mishnah, that in our Mishnah, the husband uproots the vow entirely, which means he would also uproot his own vow by nullifying hers. And that is why he is unable to do so. The fact that he's not allowed to nullify her vow must be proof that when he nullifies her vow, he uproots it entirely and doesn't just sever it from that point forward. But the Gemara refutes this argument. No. Actually, one can say that the husband severs her vow from that point forward, and if there were no other points to consider, by right, the Mishnah should have taught that he can nullify her vow for her and leave his vow intact. And this is the reason that he cannot nullify her vow. Because when she said, "I am hereby a Nazir," and he added, "and I," at that moment, he not only didn't nullify her vow, he ratified her vow. Now, his "and I" was meant to also extend her vow to him, that now he will become a Nazir too. But the fact that he heard about it and added his vow to her own indicates that he has ratified her vow. And once he ratifies her vow, he can't subsequently nullify it. And that's why a husband can't nullify a wife's vow of Naziris to which he added "and I." Since he said to her "and I," he is considered like one who said, "It is upheld for you," ratified it. And once a husband has upheld his wife's vow, he can no longer nullify it. Consequently, if he requested to have his upholding dissolved by a sage, he can nullify her vow. And if not, he cannot nullify it. Consequently, the ruling of the Mishnah does not resolve our dilemma. Does he uproot her vow when he nullifies it, or does he sever it from that point forward? So the Gemara is still looking for an answer to that question, and it cites another Mishnah, which we'll encounter on page 24a. Come in here. With regard to a woman who vowed to be a Nazir and separated her animal for this purpose, right? You have to bring animal offerings when your vow of Naziris terminates. And that's why we only do this when the temple is standing in Jerusalem, right? One who completes his Naziris brings a sin offering, and I believe it was a guilt offering and a peace offering, right? So with regard to a woman who vowed to be a Nazir and separated her animal for this purpose, and afterward her husband, or maybe, hold on a second. I'm just remembering. We'll encounter it momentarily. Anyway, she separated her animals to bring at the completion of her Naziris. And then her husband, right? So in other words, she consecrated these animals. When she set them aside to become her offerings, it's like she consecrated them. And now they can no longer, be used. They can't be worked. They can't be handled. You can't do anything with those animals because now they become the property of the temple, so to speak, the property of God. They were consecrated, right? So if she separated her animal for that purpose and afterward her husband nullified her vow, which means that she's no longer obligated to bring an offering, then what? Well, if the animal was his, which he had given to her, it is as though it were never consecrated at all. And it shall go out and graze among the flock like a regular non-consecrated animal until it becomes blemished. And if the animal was hers and it was designated for a sin offering, it must be placed in isolation for it to die, in accordance with the general law that a sin offering that may not be sacrificed must be left to die. That animal was set aside for a specific sin offering. If her vow is then uprooted, then the animal can't be offered as a sin offering, and it can't be used for some other sin offering, and so it's just left to die. You can't do anything with it, neither bring it to the temple nor use it for yourself. So the Gemara explains the difficulty from this Mishnah. And if it should enter your mind that the husband uproots the vow entirely as if it was never spoken, so then the sin offering should be released as a non-sacred animal in accordance with the law of a sin offering of a Nazir whose vow was nullified. And we'll encounter that on page 31a. So rather, must one not conclude from the Mishnah that the husband merely severs the vow from that point forward, which means that she was a Nazir when she separated the animal, and therefore it became consecrated. But the Gemara rejects this proof. Actually, I could say to you that the husband uproots the vow, and this is the reason for the above ruling. Since she requires no atonement, right? Why is there an atonement? Because she became a Nazir? Yes, because she took an unnecessary vow that rendered wine prohibited to her, and that's why a sin offering is associated with is part of the conclusion of Naziris, and it requires atonement. So since she requires no atonement because the vow is entirely uprooted, since she requires no atonement as the vow is no longer in effect, this animal is treated as a sin offering whose owners have died. And it is learned as a tradition that a sin offering whose owners have died must be left to die, right? The sin offering can't be brought for other people, and so that animal is just left to die. So the Gemara continues to cite relevant sources. Come in here the following Mishnah from 23a. With regard to a woman who vowed to be a Nazir, and nevertheless she violated her vow and she was drinking wine and rendering herself impure by contact with the dead, taking walks in the cemetery. So she incurs the 40 lashes for violating a Torah prohibition. And the Gemara analyzes this Mishnah. What is the circumstances of the case? If we say that her husband did not nullify her vow, need it be said that she is liable to receive lashes? Every Nazir who transgresses their vow is subject to lashes if they were warned right before they did it and there were witnesses, etc. So rather, it is obvious that the husband nullified her vow. And if it should enter your mind that the husband uproots his wife's vow entirely, why does she incur 40 lashes? It is as though she never vowed at all. Rather, must one not conclude from this Mishnah that the husband severs her vow? When he nullifies her vow, it severs it going forward. But what happened before he nullified her vow happened. And therefore, she's liable for her earlier transgression. But the Gemara refutes this argument. Actually, I could say to you that the husband uproots the vow entirely. And the reason that the Mishnah teaches in this manner is due to the fact that the Tana of the Mishnah teaches in the latter clause of that Mishnah, if the husband nullified her vow and she did not know, and she was drinking wine and rendering herself ritually impure by contact with the dead, she does not incur 40 lashes, despite her intention to sin, as she did not commit a transgression in practice because her vow was dissolved. Now we're on 22a. For this reason, the Tana also taught she incurs in the first clause, despite the fact that this teaches no novelty. So the Gemara further suggests, come in here a proof. We're still asking the question, when a husband dissolves his wife's vow of Naziris, does he uproot it entirely as if she never vowed, or does he merely sever her obligation from that point forward? But if she made a violation of her vow prior to that moment, she is liable to the consequences of that. So come in here a proof from a Baraisa with regard to a woman who vowed to be a Nazir and she became ritually impure, and afterward her husband nullified her vow. She brings the sin offering and she does not bring the burnt offering. Right? So the sin offering, the burnt offering, this is for a Nazir who becomes impure for the dead. They also bring 3 offerings, right? But it's a different 3. They bring a sin offering, a burnt offering, and a guilt offering. 2 birds and a lamb. So in this case, right, if she became a Nazir, she became impure for the dead, and afterward her husband nullified her vow, so she's still liable to bring the bird sin offering, but she does not bring the bird burnt offering. And if it should enter your mind that the husband severs her vow, Well, let her also bring the burnt offering to complete the atonement for becoming ritually impure while she was a Nazir before her husband nullified the vow. So this indicates that the husband uproots the vow entirely, which is why she's not required to bring the burnt offering. And the Gemara refutes this proof. It says, what are you talking about? Rather, what then? Will you say that the husband uproots the vow entirely? If so, she should also not have to bring the bird sin offering. So she should have to not be liable to bring any offerings if the husband's nullification uproots the vow as if it had never been spoken at all. And the Gemara answers, yes. So too, she should not have to bring the bird sin offering either. But in accordance with whose opinion is this baraisa? It is the opinion of Rabbi Elazar HaKapar. As it is taught in a baraisa that Rabbi Elazar HaKapar, the esteemed one, says, what is the meaning when the verse states, and make atonement for him, for that he sinned by reason of the soul? After which soul did the Nazir sin? Rather, it's because he deprived himself. By taking a vow of Naziris, you've already committed a sin in this view. The Torah says you're allowed to do it, but you have to bring a sin offering when you complete the term because you unnecessarily took on a vow that deprived you of a permitted item, namely the products of the grapevine. So rather, because he deprived himself of wine, he's therefore called a sinner. And are not these matters inferred a fortiori, like a kal v'chomer sequence? And if this one who deprived himself only of wine is nevertheless called a sinner, in the case of one who deprives himself of everything by fasting or other acts of mortification, all the more so is he labeled a sinner. That's why you don't take vows to deprive yourself of something that is permitted. So according to this opinion, she brings a sin offering to atone for uttering the vow itself, despite the fact that her husband later uprooted it entirely. Now the Gemara suggests, come in here a resolution to our question. Does the husband's nullification uproot the vow entirely or sever it? As it is taught in a baraisa, explicitly, with regard to a woman who vowed to be a Nazir, and another woman heard her and said, and I, so she becomes a Nazir also, and then the husband of the first woman came and nullified her vow. So she is permitted, meaning her vow is uprooted, and the other woman is prohibited, meaning her vow remains in place. So one can learn from this that when a husband nullifies his wife's vow of Naziris, he severs it from that time forward, but he does not uproot it as if it had never existed. And that's why that second woman who said, and I, after the first woman said, I am hereby Nazir, remains bound by her and I, even when the first woman has her vow nullified by her husband. And the Baraisa continues, Rabbi Shimon says that if the second woman said to her, after hearing her vow of Naziris, I am hereby like you, in that case, they are both permitted. Meaning, if the husband nullified the first woman's vow, then the second woman's vow also gets nullified. And that's the difference between saying, and I, meaning, and I just became a Nazir, versus, and I am like you, meaning, and I'm going to be in the same situation you're in. If you're a Nazir, I'm a Nazir. If you have your Nazirs nullified, I have my Nazirs nullified too. Now we're in 22b. Mar Zutra, the son of Rab Mari, said, this problem with regard to one who associated himself with the vow of a woman whose Naziris was later nullified is in essence the same as the dilemma of Rami Bar Chama concerning a different issue. As Rami Bar Chama raises a dilemma, if someone said about a certain object, this is forbidden to me like the flesh of a peace offering, what is the law? Is this a vow or not? Right, now we've seen, this is called a konam vow, right? Which is like, you see, if you consecrate something to give it to the temple, right? If I say that all the money in my bank account, is hereby, and I'm just teaching, I'm not making a vow, is hereby consecrated for the upkeep of the temple, so then all that money is no longer mine, right? Now that money, I can never use it for my own. I have to just give it because I've consecrated it. It can only be used for those holy purposes. If I say my money is like a gift consecrated for use in the temple, so I don't have to give it to the temple, but I am no longer permitted to make use of it, right? It's no longer available to me. I haven't promised to give it to the temple, but I can no longer benefit from it. And that kind of a vow is a valid vow, right? It's a nader, right? So that you now make something prohibited to you like it was consecrated. So here, so Rami Bar Hama raises a dilemma. If someone said about a certain object, this is forbidden to me, like the flesh of a peace offering. So what is the law? Is this a vow or not? Now the peace offering, the shalamim, this is shalamim, peace offerings. This is an interesting case because a peace offering, first of all, it's not an obligatory offering. It's not that like a sin offering. If you unwittingly transgress a Torah law, you become liable to bring a sin offering. A peace offering is not something you have to bring. You bring because you want to bring it. A sin offering, after its blood is sprinkled on the altar and certain parts of it go up in smoke, the rest of it can be eaten by a priest and no one else. A peace offering, some of it goes up in smoke, or at least the blood gets sprinkled on the altar, and then the one who brought that offering, he can eat it, right? So often peace offerings are associated, like they're sort of like Thanksgiving offerings, and then you bring it because, you've had some wonderful things happen in your life and you want to be thankful to God. And so you bring it and then you enjoy it, with your group. Now, so what's interesting about that is that the peace offering is prohibited for me to eat any of it until it's slaughtered properly in the temple and its blood is sprinkled on the altar, and then it becomes permitted for me to eat it. So the Gemara explains the two sides of the dilemma. When a person associates himself with a prohibition by means of another object, instead of just saying this is prohibited to me, I say it is prohibited to me like the flesh of a peace offering. So then what happened? In this case, this would mean that he associated himself with an article from which it is prohibited to benefit, as the flesh of a peace offering is forbidden before its blood is sprinkled. Consequently, the vow would take effect. Or perhaps we say that one associates himself with the item by its eventual, do we associate it, when you take this vow, are you associating your vow with the item in its fundamental state or in its eventual permitted state, right? If it's like a peace offering before it gets sprinkled, which is it's like a peace offering before I brought it, which is what I said, it's like the flesh of a peace offering. Well, that would imply I haven't brought it yet, so it's going to remain prohibited. Or do I say, well, no, eventually the peace offering will be permitted, and so this thing is permitted to me. So this question is apparently analogous to the issue of the second woman's vow. Is she referring to the fundamental initial state of the first vow before it was nullified by the first woman's husband, or to the later permitted state after it has been dissolved? And the Gemara refutes this argument. Are the two cases comparable? There, since he said, it is forbidden to me like the flesh of a peace offering, even though after its blood has been sprinkled, it can be eaten outside the courtyard, nevertheless, it is sacred to a certain extent, which means that his vow is referring to a forbidden object. However, here, if it should enter your mind that the second woman associates herself with the object's permitted state, her husband has nullified her vow, and therefore there is no vow at all, which renders the statement of the second woman meaningless. Now, some say that this last refutation is not accepted. In their opinion, the dilemma concerning two women who vowed is certainly similar to that of Rami Bar Hama. And the Gemara asks, if the woman said to the first who vowed Naziris, I am hereby a Nazir in your footsteps, and the husband of the first woman subsequently nullified her vow, so what is the law with regard to the second woman? Again, the Gemara clarifies the two sides of the question. Does the statement, I am hereby a Nazir in your footsteps, mean in all matters, and therefore, when the first woman's vow is dissolved, the second woman's vow is dissolved also? Or perhaps this statement is referring to her status before her husband nullified her vow, and therefore, when the first woman's vow is nullified by her husband, the second woman's vow remains in place. In other words, I am hereby Nazir in your footsteps. Is that analogous to, and I? Right? And then you become a Nazir, and if the first woman's vow is nullified, the other one remains a Nazir. Or is it more analogous to, and I am like you, right? Or at least our first understanding of I am like you. So the Gemara suggests come in here and answer to this question from the Mishna. With regard to a woman who vowed to be a Nazir, and her husband heard and said, and I, he cannot nullify her vow with which he associated himself, as he would thereby be canceling his own vow. And if it should enter your mind that when he says to her, I am hereby Nazir in your footsteps, he associates himself with the fundamental state of the vow, and it does not mean that he should be linked throughout, in that case, let him nullify her vow and uphold his own. In this manner, the husband remains bound by his own vow while he does nullify his wife's vow. Rather, must one not conclude from it that he associates himself with all matters of the vow, and therefore in his case, he cannot nullify her vow, as he would thereby be nullifying his own. But with regard to a woman who said, I'm hereby Nazir in your footsteps, she is also permitted by the nullification of the first vow. In other words, her vow goes along with the first woman's vow. And if the first woman's vow is nullified, the second woman's vow is nullified too. I'm almost done. If you have questions or comments, get them in. The Gemara rejects this argument. No. Actually, it is possible that one associates himself with the fundamental state of the vow. And here in the case of a husband, there's a different reason that he cannot nullify her vow, since he says to her, and I, or even, and I am like you, or and I am in your footsteps. In all these cases, he ratified her vow, and that's why he can't nullify it after that. Once he ratifies it, her only way out is like him, to go to a halakhic authority and have the vow nullified. And therefore, if he requests from a halakhic authority the dissolution of his ratification of her vow, then he can nullify her vow. But if he does not submit his request to a halakhic authority, he cannot nullify his wife's vow after he has already ratified. That's what I've got for us today. We did 2 dafs. Well done, class. Pages 21 and 22. And we'll pick it up on Wednesday with page 23. No class tomorrow because Nina and I have an event here in the Jewish community in LA. All right, let me go to questions or comments. On Nazir, pages 21 and 22. Joseph, I am struggling to understand why a sin offering is needed. I suppose the entire issue is more about the command to take joy in God's blessings, which means not being joyful is akin to sin. Well, first of all, this is not a universally held view that the reason one brings a sin offering at the conclusion of Naziris is because it was a quote-unquote sin to take the vow. That's Rabbi Elazar HaKapar's view, but he's also called the esteemed one, and it would seem that at least a lot of people hold that way. Now, it's not so much, I mean, in a sense, you're supposed to enjoy everything that God gave you, but even if you're a person, who doesn't like wine and you're not going to take joy from it anyway, just the fact that you took something that God said is permitted to you and you took a vow that made it not permitted to you, there's a kind of sinful aspect of that, and that's why they're saying that a sin offering is included in the offerings at the termination, at the conclusion of Naziris. But not everyone holds by that, and you could say that it's an equally good argument, or perhaps even a better argument, to say that the reason one brings a sin offering at the conclusion of his Naziris is a hook, meaning because God said so. And we don't know why a sin offering in particular is one of the offerings. God said so. Like in the same way that, sin offerings are brought for, not only because you unwittingly committed a sin, is a sin offering brought. Sin offerings are part of a few other rituals, right? I believe a sota brings a sin offering. Now, when she drinks the waters of bitterness. Now, she was suspected by her husband of infidelity. If she survives, drinking the water, which has some dirt from the temple floor and a bit of ink from the parchment on which the verses from the Torah are written, if she cheated on her husband, that would kill her. And if she's innocent, then it doesn't kill her, right? So she didn't commit infidelity. And yet I think that there's a sin offering brought there. I might be wrong about that. I'm just trying to give the example of that sin offerings are brought at other times simply because the Torah says so. Like in other words, why don't we eat, a kid boiled in its mother's milk? Like you could say it seems cruel, but there's a lot of things that seem cruel, like maybe eating animals at all. That is allowed, right? And it's not considered cruel because God said so. Why do we have to keep Shabbos? Like, why is the seventh day one that we have to rest on? There's no logical reason for that. We do it because God said so. So it might just be that including a sin offering among the other offerings at the conclusion of Nazir is because God said so. Rabbi Elazar HaKapar says, well, the reason God included that sin offering is because you never should have made that vow in the first place. So, it's not 100% clearly established that that's the reason. Bell, I too was wondering about the necessity of a sin offering. Is there a nexus between the discouragement of taking this vow and the commandment not to take the Lord's name in vain? As the conditions of Nazirim are so complicated, there may be worry that not carrying through completely would then be like taking the name in vain. I think that's really interesting. I think that if you take a vow and you're bound by it, and then you violate your vow, you become liable for violating the vow, but I don't think we would consider that taking the Lord's name in vain in the same way as knowing that you're lying when you're swearing in God's name, or knowing that you're not going to do this at the time that you speak your vow in God's name. The commandment not to take the Lord's name in vain has a lot of nuances and particulars to it that are beyond the scope of today's class. But I think the answer to your question, Bell, is the same as to Joseph's, right? Like, we're not sure. Maybe Elazar HaKapar is correct, and it's not just discouraged to take a vow of Naziris or any other vow prohibiting something on yourself, but it's sinful. Or maybe it's just discouraged, and the sin offering is included as a kind of message in that direction, but it's not specifically a sin that you're atoning for. Hard to tell, right? Hard to tell. Certainly we can, be confident in stating that the sages, as a general rule, discourage us from taking any unnecessary vows. Now, sometimes we take a vow by mistake, right? It's not like I vow that I will become a Nazir. I'm just speaking educationally, but as we've seen, Bli Neder, it's enough to say, I am hereby a Nazir. You never spoke the language of vowing, and yet it became a vow. And that's why, by the way, why we say Kol Nidre, right? The Kol Nidre prayer on the night of Yom Kippur, where we say, that all the vows that we vowed in the last year are not vows, and all the vows that we'll vow in the next year are not vows, and that's something that the rabbis added. That's not spelled out in the Torah anywhere, but the rabbis, strongly are reminding us in that first of all, we're idiots because we're human, and we often make mistakes and take a vow when we didn't mean to. But all the more so, if we, have time to think about it, we should remember, don't take a vow. Maybe you need to change your behavior. Maybe you need to abstain from destructive substances, but don't engage in that process by means of a vow that would then render, that when you gave in and violated your vow, that you actually committed a sin. It's like you've changed the world when you take a vow, because you render something that was permitted into something that is now prohibited, and you should not do that. And finally, Steve, I would imagine that the second husband of the second woman who said, and I, can nullify her vow once he learns of it. I'm sure that is correct. Yes, good analysis. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again on Wednesday. No class tomorrow, but we've already got ahead by doing a double daf today. So on Wednesday, we'll pick it up at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, with page 23. Have a good night.